In the British Museum behind glass sits a slab of baked clay no larger than a paper bag. The wedge-shaped marks pressed into it tell a story more than 4,000 years old. A king who battled a monster in a cedar forest and then went searching for a way to never die. Today, a few streets away, a novel about a war college for dragon riders sits in a shop window near the top of every bestseller list. The two were written down 40 centuries apart, and they are, unmistakably, the same kind of story. Magic and monsters and invented worlds. Impossible things told as though they were true. It is the oldest impulse in all of literature. Older than the novel, older than the writing that first recorded it. And yet fantasy, the genre, the section in the bookshop, is barely 100 years old. For most of human history, the most ancient kind of story we tell did not even have a name. So this is the story of how it finally got one. How the impossible went from humanity's first literature to a Victorian act of pure invention to one Oxford professor's life's work, and then to a billion-dollar genre that has spent every decade since at war with itself. From clay tablets to a phone screen, it is a single unbroken chain stretching across 4,000 years. This is the entire history of fantasy. And to find where it truly starts, we have to go a long way back, to a time long before anyone had thought to give it a name at all. It begins in the city of Uruk more than 4,000 years ago on tablets of wet clay pressed with the wedge tip of a reed. A king named Gilgamesh, 2/3 god, 1/3 man, rules his people so harshly that they cry out to the heavens for relief. The gods answer in a way that only a fantasy could invent. They tell the goddess Aruru to take a pinch of clay, the same stuff the story itself is written on, and shape from it a wild man strong enough to be the king's equal. His name is Enkidu, and he is born among the animals, running with the gazelles, until he is lured into the human world and tamed. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu finally meet, they fight so violently they nearly bring the palace down, and then, the way enemies sometimes do, they become inseparable. Together they go looking for glory. They journey to a forbidden cedar forest and kill the monster who guards it, the giant Humbaba. When the goddess Ishtar offers herself to Gilgamesh and he refuses her, she sends a divine bull to ravage the land, and they kill that too. And here the story turns, the way the greatest of these old stories always seem to turn, toward loss. The gods decide that for the killing of Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven, one of the two friends must die. Enkidu sickens, curses the day he was made human, and slips away. Gilgamesh, the half-god king who feared nothing, is undone by it. He cannot accept that the friend who was made his equal is simply gone, and for the rest of the epic he wanders the wild places of the earth in animal skins, searching for the one prize no hero has ever carried home, a way to never die. He very nearly succeeds. He crosses the waters of death and finds Utnapishtim, the one man the gods made immortal, the survivor of a great flood that drowned the world, a flood story set down long before the book of Genesis told its own. Utnapishtim tells him of a plant at the bottom of the sea that restores a man's lost youth, and Gilgamesh dives for it and brings it up in his hands. Then, on the long road home, while he stops to bathe in a cool pool, a serpent glides out of the water, eats the plant, sheds its skin, and slides away renewed. And the cure for death is gone forever, taken by a snake, and the king goes home empty-handed to die like everyone else. Consider the shape of that story for a moment, because almost everything fantasy would ever do is already inside it. A more than human hero, a wild companion shaped by the gods to be his match, a monster guarding a forbidden wilderness, a quest that costs the hero everything he loves, and ends, for all its wonders, in loss. This is among the very oldest surviving works of literature on the planet, older than the Bible, older than Homer, and it is, beat for beat, a fantasy story. It simply had no idea that it was one. The same is true of almost everything that follows it across the ancient world. Around the 8th century before our era, the Greeks gave us Homer, and the gods of Olympus walked straight through his poems as active characters, taking sides at the walls of Troy, shielding their favorites, striking down men who offend them. In the Odyssey, a soldier and king named Odysseus spends 10 years trying to sail home from that war through a sea his gods will not let him cross, past a one-eyed giant who eats his men alive, past a witch who turns his sailors into pigs, past the singing creatures whose voices lure sailors to their deaths, down into the land of the dead and back. More than 1,500 years after Homer, in the cold of early medieval England, an unknown poet set down Beowulf and handed the future of fantasy a template it has never once let go of. In Beowulf, a great hall stands under threat, and a hero crosses the sea to defend it. There, a monster called Grendel comes out of the dark to slaughter the sleeping men inside, and the hero tears its arm off with his bare hands. Then Grendel's mother rises from the bottom of a haunted mere to take revenge, and the hero must dive down to meet her in her own lair. And 50 years later, when Beowulf is an old king, the last of his trials comes for him. A dragon, woken by a stolen cup, coiled around a hoard of gold, and the fight that kills them both. A hole, a monster, a descent, and a dragon at the end. That shape still echoes all through modern fantasy today. From the east came another vast reservoir of the fantastic, the 1001 Nights of Scheherazade. There the frame itself is the magic. A king, betrayed by one wife, has resolved to marry a new bride every night and execute her every morning, until a clever woman named Scheherazade begins telling him a story so gripping that he spares her until tomorrow to hear the end, and then begins another. For 1001 nights she keeps herself alive on cliffhangers, and the tales she tells fill with jinn and sorcerers, enchantments and impossible voyages, the whole glittering apparatus of wonder. Curiously, the most famous ancient wonders of all, Aladdin's lamp and the flying carpet, were not in the original Arabic at all. A French translator slipped them in 3 centuries ago. Meanwhile, across medieval Europe, the legend of King Arthur grew out of a single audacious book. Around the year 1136, a cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote a history of the kings of Britain and presented it with a perfectly straight face as sober fact, fixing in place Arthur, reshaping an older Welsh prophet named Merlin into the wizard Merlin, and laying down the whole mythic spine of British kingship. French poets seized on it and spun it into romance, adding Lancelot and the quest for the Holy Grail, until the matter of Britain was an entire literature of its own. Around 1470, a knight in prison named Thomas Malory gathered the sprawling tangle into one English masterwork, Le Morte d'Arthur, which William Caxton printed in 1485 in the very first generation of the printing press. There was also the cold mythology of the North, which would shape the genre's future more than almost anything else here. Medieval Icelanders wrote down the Old Norse myths and heroic legends, the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, the tales of Odin who hanged himself on the world tree for 9 nights to win the secret of the runes, of Thor and his hammer, of a whole pantheon of gods marching knowingly toward Ragnarok, the foretold end of the world in which even the gods are killed. In the saga of the Volsungs, they told of a cursed ring of gold that destroys everyone who holds it, and of a hero who slays a dragon, tastes its blood, and abruptly understands the speech of birds. If any of that sounds familiar, it should. Centuries later, an Oxford philologist would read those same Eddas in the original Old Norse and draw on them directly. Many of the names of his dwarves and the name Gandalf itself come straight out of a list of dwarf names buried in one Old Norse poem, and the cursed ring, the slain dragon, and the doomed last stand against the dark all carry the genes of the northern myths. The roots of modern fantasy do not merely run deep. In several places they run straight, name by name, into the texts a young Tolkien would one day spend his whole life studying. Running alongside all of these was the fairy tale. The old folk stories of Europe, passed mouth to mouth for centuries, began to be gathered up and written down by Charles Perrault in France in the 1690s, who set down Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty and Puss in Boots in elegant courtly prose, by the brothers Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm in Germany, whose famous collection of German folk and fairy tales first appeared in 1812, often in forms far darker and stranger than the softened versions the world would later settle for, and by Hans Christian Andersen in Denmark, who from the 1830s did something newer still, inventing original fairy tales, The Little Mermaid, The Emperor's New Clothes, out of his own head rather than collecting them from others. The literary fairy tale is the missing link between the old myths and the genre to come, short, strange, frankly impossible stories, deliberately written down and read for pleasure by adults and children alike. It is no accident that the writer who would do more than anyone to reinvent the form a few decades later called his own breakthrough book a fairy romance. There is a difficulty here though, and this documentary will keep returning to it. Not one of these works thought of itself as fantasy. The people who first heard about the gods of Gilgamesh or the gods of Homer did not consider them impossible. They were part of the fabric of the world, as real as the weather and the harvest. The medieval audiences that thrilled to Arthur half believed he had truly reigned, that Geoffrey's history was history. There is one persuasive way to draw the line. A story becomes fantasy in the way we now mean the word when its own world quietly understands that the magic is invented, when an author deliberately builds something they know to be untrue, and asks a grown reader to step inside it anyway, eyes open by choice. By that measure, none of this is yet the genre as we know it. It is the root system, the enormous ancient root system out of which the genre would one day grow. And on that same reckoning, the question of when the impossible turned into fantasy has one surprisingly precise answer. It waits about 400 years after Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur in Victorian Britain, with a struggling Scottish minister who decided to build a dream country he knew perfectly well was not real, and to write it, pointedly, for adults. His name was George MacDonald. He had trained as a clergyman, been pushed out of his pulpit for preaching ideas his congregation found too strange and too generous, and turned to writing partly because he needed to feed his enormous family. In 1858, he published a drifting, luminous, deeply odd book called Phantastes. Its hero, a young man named Anodos, wakes one morning to find his bedroom dissolving, the carpet sprouting grass, the basin becoming a spring, and walks out of the ordinary world into fairyland, where he moves from one uncanny encounter to the next, with the loose, shifting logic of a dream. There is no clear quest and no dragon to slay. What there is instead is a deliberate act of construction, an entire imagined country, governed by its own dream rules, built and offered to the reader as an experience worth having purely for its own sake. And MacDonald did one thing on the title page that turns out to matter enormously. He called it a fairy romance for men and women, in an age that had quietly filed the fantastic away in the nursery, as something children grew out of. That single phrase was a declaration of war, a claim that grown adults could take an invented world seriously, could find in it not an escape from meaning, but a deeper road toward it. The entire genre, in a sense, is still defending that subtitle today. MacDonald mattered as much for whom he touched as for what he wrote. Decades later, a young C.S. Lewis would buy a worn copy of Phantastes at a railway station, read it on the train, and say afterward that it had baptized his imagination, that something in it had quietly converted him to a sense of holiness in story long before he believed anything else. A young Tolkien absorbed him too, and would cite MacDonald's goblins as ancestors of his own. The man with as strong a claim as anyone to being the first true fantasy novelist was also directly the godfather of the two writers who would one day define the genre's golden age. He went on to write The Princess and the Goblin in 1872, and a shelf of other works, and he insisted in an essay called The Fantastic Imagination that the maker of a fairy tale world takes on a real responsibility. Invent whatever laws one likes, he argued, but once they are set, one must obey them faithfully, or the whole dream collapses. It is a rule the genre's craftsmen would still be arguing about well over a century later. MacDonald was not working alone either. Victorian Britain turned out to be the genre's true cradle, a whole island suddenly thick with the fantastic. In 1865, an Oxford mathematician named Charles Dodgson, better known by his pen name Lewis Carroll, sent a little girl tumbling down a rabbit hole in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and built a nonsense logic dream world that has never once left the culture since. Fairy tales, ghost stories, and invented wonderlands poured off the British presses through the second half of the century, as an industrial, rationalist, railway-building society found itself hungry, almost guiltily so, for the enchantment it could no longer quite bring itself to believe in. It is one of the genre's quiet ironies that fantasy as we know it was born not in some misty mythic age, but in the smoke and iron of the most relentlessly modern society the world had yet produced. The Victorians laid the railways and raised the factories, and in nearly the same breath, they invented the literature of longing to escape them. A great deal of that enchantment was aimed pointedly at children. The Victorians did more than anyone to shape children's fantasy into the form we know now. 2 years before Alice in 1863, the clergyman Charles Kingsley sent a drowned chimney sweep into an underwater fairy world in The Water Babies. The decades that followed filled nursery shelves with talking animals, and with doors into 100 other worlds. It was a curious double movement. The same culture that was busy grinding childhood up in its factories and mines was also building in its books elaborate imaginary refugees for the young. Out of that Victorian nursery came the whole enduring tradition of the child who steps through a wardrobe or down a rabbit hole or out a bedroom window into somewhere impossible. A tradition that runs straight on through Narnia and Peter Pan and Harry Potter. The genre's grown-up branch and its children's branch grew up side by side, twined together, and they would go on feeding each other for the next 100 years. Then, in the 1890s, a very different Englishman took the decisive step. William Morris was already one of the most famous men in Britain, A designer whose printed fabrics and tapestries still hang in museums, a poet, a translator of sagas, a fierce and tireless socialist, and the founder of his own beautiful printing house, the Kelmscott Press. Late in his crowded life, he turned to prose romance and wrote a handful of books that did something almost no one had attempted before. The Wood Beyond the World in 1894 and The Well at the World's End in 1896 are set in lands that exist nowhere on any map. These are among the earliest fully realized self-contained worlds. Their own geography, their own history, there to be traveled for the sheer pleasure of traveling them, owing nothing to any real country and asking to be taken entirely on their own terms. There is no allegory waiting to be decoded, no real England in disguise, no waking up at the end to find it was all a dream. There is simply a second world standing on its own foundations. That move, the freestanding secondary world, sits at the dead center of almost all modern fantasy, and Morris was among the first to build one whole and self-supporting, in a deliberately antique chant-like prose that would echo straight through E.R. Edison and into the ear of a young Oxford student named Tolkien, who read Morris closely and never forgot him. So by the close of the 19th century, the essential machine of the genre had been built and tested. An invented world, constructed by an author who knows full well it is invented, written for adults and entered for its own sake. Almost everything after this is reaction and refinement. But notice the thing the genre still did not have. It had no shelf. There was no section in any bookshop labeled fantasy, no category in any publisher's catalog, no recognized genre a reader could point to and ask a bookseller for more of. The thing existed, fully formed in MacDonald and Morris, years before anyone thought to call it anything at all. The writers who came next would deepen the invention even further by giving these imaginary worlds something they had so far borrowed from the real one, their own gods. The man who did it was an Irish aristocrat with one of the great names in literary history, Edward Plunkett, the 18th Baron of Dunsany, who wrote simply as Lord Dunsany. In 1905, in a slim and strange little book called The Gods of Pegana, he invented an entire religion. This wasn't a borrowed myth or a reshuffled set of Greek or Norse deities, but an original pantheon built from the ground up, a supreme god who sleeps, and whose dreaming is the only reason the universe continues to exist, a drummer named Skal who must beat his drum forever, because on the day the drumming stops, the great god will wake and the dream of the world will end. And below them a whole hierarchy of smaller gods with their own names and natures and jealousies, all narrated in a grave, hypnotic, invented scripture voice. Few writers before Dunsany had built a complete original pantheon from nothing, invented gods with their own names, their own myths, their own theology. After him, that became something a fantasy world could simply have. A young American named H.P. Lovecraft read Dunsany and took the lesson directly to heart, openly crediting him for the idea of an invented pantheon and a made-up mythic background. The scaffolding on which Lovecraft would later raise his own Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth. Tolkien would build his own vast mythology. Le Guin would invent her own cosmologies. The now unremarkable idea that a serious fantasy world ought to come with its own invented religion starts here, with an Irish baron writing fake scripture in 1905. Dunsany was no recluse either. For a stretch of the 1910s, he was among the most widely staged playwrights of his day, his short fantastical dramas filling theaters in Dublin, London, and New York, carrying invented gods and far countries to crowds who would never have dreamed of calling any of it fantasy. And he was not alone in the strangeness. The same Edwardian years produced William Hope Hodgson, a former merchant sailor who wrote visionary dread-soaked fantasies of the deep ocean and the dying earth. His 1912 novel The Nightland imagines a far future in which the sun has gone out and the last remnant of humanity huddles inside a vast metal redoubt against the dark, one of the bleakest and most wholly original visions the young genre had yet produced. The invention was everywhere in these decades, in every register from the whimsical to the apocalyptic. While Dunsany was inventing gods, an American had already opened a separate front across the ocean. In 1900, L. Frank Baum published The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and announced in his own introduction that he was finished with the old European fairy tale, the Brothers Grimm and their cautionary horrors, their morals stapled to every page. He wanted a modernized, homegrown, distinctly American wonder tale, with a sensible Kansas farm girl at its center, and he built one. A fully realized invented country reached by tornado, with its own peoples and creatures and rules and an emerald capital, and a humbug wizard who turns out to be an ordinary man behind a curtain. Where the British strand was antique and dreamlike, the American one was bright and briskly practical, suspicious of kings and warm toward ordinary people. The two traditions would not truly merge for another half-century, but the American imagination had staked its claim early and emphatically. The invention kept deepening on both sides of the Atlantic. In 1922, E.R. Edison published The Worm Ouroboros, a vast and gorgeous and unapologetically archaic epic of warring kingdoms on a world he cheerfully set on the planet Mercury. Written in a thick Jacobean prose that reads like Morris turned up to operatic volume, a direct ancestor of the doorstop epic fantasy still to come. In 1926, Hope Mirrlees released Blood in the Mist, one of the quiet masterpieces of the entire form. The story of a sensible, prosperous, deeply respectable town that has outlawed any mention of the magical country sharing its border, and what happens when the forbidden fruit of fairyland starts crossing over anyway, and unsettling the citizens who have spent their lives pretending the magic next door does not exist. It belonged to a whole wave of adult fantasy that surfaced in Britain in the years after the First World War, as though a generation that had seen too much of the real world's horror went looking, deliberately, for somewhere else to stand. For the next several decades, the genre simmered without ever quite boiling over. It survived in scattered pockets that rarely spoke to one another, in children's books and in the lurid pulps, with the occasional strange literary one-off besides, but almost nobody yet thought of these as branches of a single tree. A reader who loved Dunsany had no reliable way to find Edison, and would never have dreamed that the cheap pulp adventures and the children's wonder tales were reaching for the very same impossible thing. The fantastic was everywhere and nowhere at once, 1,000 separate streams with no single river to gather them. What would finally bring all those streams together was still decades away. In the meantime, the rowdiest and least respectable corner of the whole field was about to come roaring off the cheapest paper in America, where a brasher, hungrier kind of fantasy was already taking shape. That paper had a name, the pulps. The cheap magazines printed on rough wood pulp stock and sold for pocket change on American newsstands through the 1920s and 30s. They were gaudy and disreputable and wildly popular, and they ran every kind of cheap thrill. Detective stories, westerns, romance, science fiction. In 1923, one of them launched that would change the genre's whole future. Weird Tales, the first major American pulp magazine devoted to weird and fantastic fiction. It paid its writers almost nothing, sometimes late, and it looked like trash on the rack. It became the laboratory where a whole new kind of fantasy was forged at speed, story by story, deadline by deadline, written by young men who needed the center word and wrote like the rent was due. Out of that one struggling magazine came H.P. Lovecraft and his cosmic horror, Clark Ashton Smith and his jeweled dying worlds, and the man who concerns us most here. His greatest creation arrived in the issue of December 1932. In a story called The Phoenix on the Sword. The author was a young Texan named Robert E. Howard in his mid-20s, writing furiously from a small town in the oil country. And the hero was a black-haired, sullen-eyed barbarian who had wandered down out of the frozen north to thieve and soldier, and eventually to seize a crown with his own hands. His name was Conan. Conan was the opposite of nearly everything the British dreamers had built. Where Morris wrote chant-like prose about gentle invented countries, Howard wrote fast, hard, physical adventure set in a brutal invented prehistory he called the Hyborian Age. A sprawling lost epoch he worked out in a fake scholarly essay, complete with migrations and fallen empires, so that his stories would have real ground under them. It was a world thin on benevolent gods and thick with sorcerers, ruined cities, and slithering things older than man, where problems were solved with a sword and a cold animal cunning, and where civilization itself was a thin and temporary crust over savagery. This was fantasy stripped down to pure forward motion, muscle, and danger and momentum, and it founded an entire subgenre, one the genre has never been without since. Howard himself flared and was gone with terrible speed. He took his own life in 1936 at the age of 30, having written Conan into immortality in barely 4 years of work. But the seed had taken root, and other writers reached for it. Catherine Lucille Moore, publishing as C.L. Moore as a number of women in the pulps did, created Jirel of Joiry in 1934, a fierce red-haired warrior lady who strode through the same kind of dark sorceress adventure as Conan, and proved early that the genre's brawling hero did not have to be a man. It was another of these pulp descendants, Fritz Leiber, who finally pinned a durable name onto this rowdy branch of the tradition. Leiber wrote his own classics of the form, The Rogue's Fafard and the Grey Mouser, thieving and scheming through the shadowed alleys of a city called Lankhmar, And when a young British writer named Michael Moorcock used the fan magazines around 1961 to call for somebody to name the kind of muscular adventure Howard had pioneered, it was Leiber who answered him with the label that stuck: Sword and Sorcery. It is a small, almost accidental moment, two working writers settling a question in the back pages of a fanzine. But it matters because it is the first time any large piece of this tradition got a real, repeatable name pinned to it. Notice though what got named. Not fantasy itself. The whole sprawling genre still had no agreed label of its own. Only its rowdiest corner, the sword and sorcery adventure. And even that name came not from the literary establishment, not from the critics or the universities, but from the cheapest and most looked down upon corner of all of publishing. Sword and sorcery did not stay buried in the old pulps either. In the 1960s, the very decade Tolkien was conquering the paperback racks, Conan came roaring back, reissued in cheap paperbacks with lurid, muscle-bound covers, edited and expanded by later hands, so that a whole new generation discovered Howard's Barbarian on the same spinner rack as Tolkien's Hobbits. Where Middle-earth offered moral grandeur and bottomless history, Conan offered raw speed and a hero who answered every problem with a blade. And readers, it turned out, were hungry for both at once. That brawling, monster-haunted strain of fantasy would feed almost directly into the tabletop role-playing games of the following decade, and from there into video games. Until the sword and sorcery template Howard had improvised at a typewriter in Depression-era Texas became the default grammar of interactive fantasy for the rest of the century. The Dreamers had given the genre its depth. The pulps gave it its drive and its appetite for adventure. The pulps had handed fantasy something else as well, whole other worlds. 2 full decades before Conan in 1912, a struggling businessman named Edgar Rice Burroughs published a serial about a Civil War veteran mysteriously carried to Mars, a dying red planet of warring city-states, 6-limbed green giants, and a captive princess. With it, he more or less single-handedly invented the form we now call planetary romance. The Barsoom stories were a sensation, and Burroughs followed them that same year with A Nobleman's Child raised by apes in the African jungle, Tarzan, a creation so popular it made him one of the most widely read authors alive. Burroughs cared little for plausibility and everything for headlong pace, and a whole generation grew up on his dying Martian sea bottoms and lost jungle cities. Among them, the young writers who would go on to build the space operas of science fiction and the sword and planet adventures that straddle the border between fantasy and the stars. By that time, the invented world had slipped the boundaries of the Earth entirely. So by the early 1960s, the genre stood with a body of work reaching back to 1858, 2 distinct and barely speaking strands. The lordly dreamers on one side, the pulp brawlers on the other, and the first faint beginnings of a name. What it still did not have was a center, a single work large enough and loved widely enough that everything else in the genre would be forced to define itself in relation to it. And that work was by then already finished and sitting quietly in the shops, written across decades by a shy Oxford professor who had spent his entire life on a private hobby almost nobody else understood. The professor was John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, and the hobby was languages. Tolkien was a philologist, a scholar of the deep history and structure of words, and from boyhood he had invented languages for the sheer pleasure of it, building their grammar and their sounds and their roots until they felt real on the tongue. He survived the trenches of the First World War and carried its losses into everything he made. At some point he understood the thing that would reorganize his whole imaginative life. A language needs a people to speak it, and a people needs a homeland and a history and a mythology of its own. So almost backward, he began constructing a world to give his invented elvish tongue somewhere to live and someone to speak them. Middle-earth did not begin as a story at all. It began as a home for a language. That war lived inside the work too. Tolkien fought at the Somme in 1916, watched 2 of his 3 closest school friends die in the war, and began writing the earliest fragments of his mythology during his convalescence. A wounded young man building a world of light partly in order to survive a world of mud. In 1939, in a lecture later published as On Fairy Stories, he did something none of his predecessors had quite managed. He gave the genre a theory of itself. The maker of an imaginary world, Tolkien argued, is a sub-creator, a small human echo of the divine act of creation, who builds a secondary world so internally consistent that the reader's mind can step inside it and grant it what he called secondary belief, accepting it as true for as long as one stays within its borders. Not a grudging suspension of disbelief, he insisted, but something stronger and stranger, a made world solid enough to be believed in on its own terms. And in that same lecture, he defended fantasy against the old charge that it was mere childish escapism, arguing that the escape it offers is the honorable escape of a prisoner from a cell, not the cowardice of a deserter fleeing his duty. Where his Victorian forebears had defended adult fantasy by example and built the first freestanding invented worlds, Tolkien did all of that, and then explained with a scholar's precision exactly what the genre was doing and why it was worth doing. The first fragment of it to reach the public arrived in 1937, and it arrived almost by accident. By Tolkien's own account, it had begun on a blank page he came across while grading a dreary stack of exam papers, where, for no reason he could ever fully explain, he scribbled a single sentence. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit, without yet having the faintest idea what a hobbit was. He spun the little creature into bedtime stories for his children, and at last wrote the whole thing down. The Hobbit was published as a children's book, it sold briskly, and its publisher wanted a sequel. What Tolkien handed them instead, after 12 long years of painstaking, world-deepening labor, was something nobody had asked for and nothing had prepared them for. A vast, dense, mortally serious epic published across 3 volumes between 1954 and 1955, called The Lord of the Rings. It gathered up the whole apparatus the genre had spent a century assembling. Morris's freestanding secondary world, Dunsany's invented mythology, MacDonald's moral seriousness about the soul, and fused them at a scale and a depth that simply dwarfed everything that had come before. Here was a world with thousands of years of internal history standing behind every scene, with fully worked languages and alphabets, with its own maps and songs and genealogies and calendars, all of it pressing up beneath a single quest like the unseen 9/10ths of an iceberg. A reader felt the weight of all that submerged history even when they could not see it, and the feeling was new. That submerged history was no metaphor. Tolkien had genuinely built it. Beneath the Lord of the Rings sat decades of invented language, 2 full Elvish tongues, Quenya and Sindarin, each with its own grammar and sound and a long imagined history behind it, along with sketches of a dozen more. He drew the maps himself, or sketched the drafts his son Christopher would later redraw for print. He wrote out genealogies running back through whole dynasties, invented calendars and scripts, and composed poetry in languages he had made up. Most of it never appears in the story at all. It simply stands behind the story, holding it upright. When a character recites a verse in Elvish, or a ruin is named for a king who fell 3,000 years before the action begins, the reader cannot follow the reference, and yet feels unmistakably that there is a real history down there that could be followed. That was the trick nobody had pulled before at this depth. A world that behaves as though it existed long before the reader arrived and will keep on existing long after the final page. Every doorstop fantasy with an appendix and a fold-out map is a descendant of those private notebooks. Tolkien had not built it alone, or in silence. He belonged to an Oxford circle that called itself the Inklings, a group of friends who met in college rooms and in the back of a pub to read their unfinished work aloud to one another and argue it into shape. Chief among them was his close friend C.S. Lewis, the very same Lewis whose imagination MacDonald's fantasts had baptized on a train years before. And Lewis was busy building a fantasy of his own. Between 1950 and 1956, he published the 7 Chronicles of Narnia, beginning with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and carried fantasy through a wardrobe door to an enormous audience of children, wrapping Christian myth in talking beasts and a great golden lion. 2 friends in a single university town, encouraging and needling each other across a pub table, between them wrote the 2 most influential fantasy works of the entire 20th century. It is worth remembering that Tolkien did all of this as a sideline. His real job was scholarship, and in 1936 he delivered a lecture that quietly revolutionized the study of Beowulf, the very poem this documentary met early on, arguing that the 1,000-year-old work should be read as a true work of art, a real and serious story about monsters and mortality, rather than picked over as a dry historical document. The same man who insisted that scholars take an old poem's dragon seriously was in his evenings building a world to house dragons of his own. In Tolkien, the scholar and the maker were never 2 separate people. He brought a philologist's patience and a medievalist's ear to the invention of Middle-earth. And that fusion, rigor in the service of wonder, is a large part of why the finished thing felt less like a made-up story than like a genuine ancient mythology that had simply been recovered and translated. It is genuinely hard to overstate what Tolkien did to the shape of the genre after him. The critic Brian Atterbury put it precisely. After Tolkien, fantasy stopped being defined by its outer boundaries and came instead to be defined by its center, and that center was The Lord of the Rings. Every writer who came afterward would have to position themselves somewhere in relation to it, nearer or farther, in homage or in revolt. As one much-quoted summary has it, almost every fantasy author since is either imitating Tolkien or else trying desperately to escape his influence. That gravity is the force this documentary will watch bend the rest of the story. But notice the double edge already, because it shadows everything that follows. The same enormous pull that would build an entire industry would also for decades flatten it, generating tide after tide of pale imitation. The same wise wizards and dark lords and farm boys with secret destinies and quests to drop a magic object into a faraway fire. All of it copied without the depth and the grief and the linguistic obsession that had made the original matter. Tolkien handed the genre a center and a curse in the very same gesture. The imitators rarely understood what they were actually copying. They reproduced the surface, the elves and the Dark Lord, the band of mismatched companions, the magic ring or sword or amulet, without the things that had made those surfaces matter underneath. The decades of invented history pressing up from below, the philologist's ear for the music of a language, the private grief of a man who had buried his closest friends in a real war. They copied the map and missed the world. For a long generation, the bestseller lists filled up with competent, hollow echoes of Middle-earth, until the very word fantasy came for a great many serious readers to mean exactly that. A formula, a costume one could rent for an afternoon. The rebellion that was coming would aim itself at those hollow echoes every bit as much as at Tolkien himself. It is worth pausing before the imitators take over the story, to notice that the genre was never only Tolkien, not even at his height. At almost the very moment he was finishing The Lord of the Rings, an English painter and poet named Mervyn Peake was building something utterly unlike it. His Gormenghast novels, beginning with Titus Groan in 1946, unfold largely inside a single colossal crumbling castle, a labyrinth of suffocating ritual and slow decay, peopled by grotesques, where almost nothing that could be called magic ever happens. It is a fantasy of pure atmosphere and rot, owing nothing to quests or dark lords or invented pantheons. Peake proved, even as the Tolkien template was hardening around him, that a secondary world could be built for its mood alone. The genre had more than one possible future in front of it, and only one of them was Middle-earth. But it would take the field a couple of decades to remember that. And yet, for almost a full decade, that center barely moved the marketplace. The Lord of the Rings sold steadily but unspectacularly in expensive British hardcovers. Admired by a devoted few, the explosion, when it came from a place Tolkien never expected and did not welcome. A cheap American paperback set off by a legal accident. In the mid-1960s, an American publisher exploited an apparent gap in the US copyright and rushed out an unauthorized paperback edition of the whole trilogy, cheap enough for any student to afford. To fight back, Tolkien's authorized American publisher hurried out its own corrected paperback. And Tolkien himself, in a pointed note added to the authorized edition, urged readers to buy only that one, which helped spark a genuine fan backlash against the pirate. Suddenly the books were everywhere, affordable, portable, slipped into 1,000 backpacks. They swept American college campuses in the counterculture years and became a genuine phenomenon, an underground passion. Students wore badges reading Frodo Lives and scrawled Gandalf for President on walls. A shy professor's Quiet Life's work had become a mass market sensation, almost against his will, and the publishing industry absorbed the only lesson it ever truly learns. There was money here, a great deal of money. That realization is what finally gave the genre a category of its own and a shelf to put it on. The publishers who had watched Tolkien sell in those numbers wanted more of whatever this was, and to sell more of it, they needed a word for it and a place to put it on the rack. Between 1969 and 1974, the American House Ballantine ran a remarkable and slightly heroic experiment called the Adult Fantasy Series, edited by the writer and tireless enthusiast Lynn Carter. Its mission was, in effect, to go and find Tolkien's ancestors. Carter reached back and reprinted the very books this documentary has already walked through. Morris and his freestanding invented worlds, Dunsany and his invented gods, Edison's operatic epic, Mirrlees's forbidden fairyland, and packaged them for the first time in history under a single unifying banner with a single word on it: fantasy. For the first time, a reader could walk into a bookshop and find these books gathered and sold under that single banner, arranged as a tradition, a lineage, a heritage, and Tolkien planted firmly at the center of the whole arrangement, the sun the rest were said to orbit. The Ballantine experiment itself wound down in 1974. Never the mass-market success its publisher had hoped for. Too early and too purely literary for the readership it had helped bring into being. But the door it had opened never swung shut again. A few years later, the same publisher launched a new imprint, Del Rey, run by editors who had absorbed the commercial lesson exactly, that readers wanted the Tolkien feeling delivered to them reliably and often. And it was Del Rey that would soon publish Terry Brooks and the flood that came after him. Fantasy, which for decades had been shelved together with science fiction as a single faintly disreputable category, when it was shelved as anything at all, now began to pull away into a section of its own. It got its own editors who specialized in it, its own recognizable cover conventions, its own fiercely devoted readership that knew exactly what it wanted and asked for it by name. The split took years and was never perfectly clean, but the direction was unmistakable. Where there had once been only scattered books that happened to contain magic, there was now a commercial machine built to find more of them and sell them as a category. The genre that had gone more than a century without a shelf to call its own suddenly had everything at once. A name on that shelf, a canon of ancestors, a center to orbit, and a fast-growing army of new writers ready either to feed the demand or to fight it. What just happened is stranger than it sounds, and it is worth slowing down for. The lineage this documentary has been narrating, MacDonald to Morris to Dunsany to Edison, was, in a very real sense, assembled after the fact. Those authors did not know they were founding a genre. Most of them were long dead, before the genre had a name at all. It was only once Tolkien proved there was a vast hungry audience and a real industry to be built that publishers went looking backward for his forerunners, found them scattered across 70 years, and wrote them into a single coherent story called the history of fantasy. The shelf, in other words, helped create the tradition just as much as the tradition created the shelf. The genre named itself by reaching back into its own past and claiming it as ancestry. And the very instant it had a stable center to stand on, a new generation of writers began doing the thing the genre has gone on doing ever since. They started taking that center apart. The first blow against the Tolkien center did not come from anger. It came from a quiet, profound little book about a boy who makes a terrible mistake. In 1968, a small West Coast press published A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin, and it pointed the whole genre in a direction Tolkien had never gone. Earthsea is a world of islands scattered across a wide sea, and its hero, Ged, is a village bronzesmith's son with enormous magical talent and one fatal flaw: pride. Sent to a school for wizards on the island of Rogue, a school of magic for gifted children 3 full decades before anyone had heard of Hogwarts, Ged shows off to humiliate a rival, reaches beyond his skill, and tears a hole in the fabric of the world, letting loose a nameless shadow that begins to hunt him across the islands. For most of the novel he flees it in terror. Then slowly he understands that he can never escape it, and turns to hunt the thing that is hunting him. The climax is not a battle, it is a naming. When Ged finally corners the shadow at the edge of the world, he speaks to it the one name that defeats it, his own, because the darkness pursuing him was himself all along, his own pride and cruelty and mortality, and a person becomes whole only by turning to face the worst that is in them. Tolkien's epics looked outward, toward a war against a distant Dark Lord. Le Guin turned the camera all the way around. Her great battle happens inside a single boy's soul. She did something else just as influential and quieter. In Earthsea, magic runs on a strict and beautiful rule. Everything in the world has a true name in the old speech, and to know a thing's true name is to hold complete power over it, which means a wizard who wants to change the world must first understand it, name it exactly, and answer for whatever his meddling unbalances, because the world rests on a delicate equilibrium, and every act of power has a price somewhere down the line. This is one of the earliest fully worked examples of what later writers would become obsessed with: a magic system with firm, knowable, consistent laws, the deliberate opposite of Tolkien's deep and misty and gloriously unexplained enchantment. And Le Guin did one more thing almost without comment. She made Ged and nearly all his people brown and red-skinned, and the warlike invaders who menaced them pale and white, quietly inverting the racial defaults the genre had inherited and never questioned. A whole alternative road for fantasy, inward, disciplined, ethical, questioning, opens with this one slim novel for children. There was a philosophy underneath that discipline too. Le Guin was profoundly shaped by Taoist thought, and Earthsea runs on it. The conviction that the world is a balance of forces, that real power often lies in knowing when not to act, that every spell cast to bend the world exacts a cost that comes due somewhere the wizard cannot see. It was a fantasy of restraint in a genre fast growing, addicted to escalation. Le Guin was not finished with Earthsea or with herself. Decades later, she went back to the islands and, with a clear and unsparing eye, took her own earlier books apart. Their quiet assumption that the great mages were always men, that power and heroism wore a male face, and rewrote the balance of the whole world from the point of view of the women it had left in the margins. Few writers have ever revised their own masterpiece so honestly. The questioning path she opened in 1968 turned out to be not a single book, but a 50-year argument the genre is still catching up to. The other great rebel of the era was angrier and stranger. Michael Moorcock had been writing since the early 1960s about Elric of Melniboné, who is the deliberate anti-Conan and anti-Aragorn in a single doomed figure, an albino sorcerer emperor of a cruel and decadent dying empire, so physically frail he cannot live without drugs and sorcery, and ultimately without his sentient black runesword Stormbringer, which keeps him strong by drinking the souls of those it kills, including one by one the people Elric loves most, until it takes the last of them and then takes him. Where the classic hero was strong and virtuous and triumphant, Elric was weak, cursed, and complicit in his own ruin, a hero who destroys everything he touches. Moorcock wrote him fast and feverishly, at the heart of the science fiction new wave that prized experiment and discomfort over reassurance. In 1978, he turned his disgust into open argument with a now infamous essay titled Epic Pooh. Its charge was blunt, that Tolkien and the whole comforting, pastoral, Tolkien-esque tradition were a kind of nursery sedative, nostalgic, consoling, politically conservative, lulling grown readers to sleep with dreams of a cozy green past, when fantasy ought to be waking them up and unsettling them instead. It remains the most famous case anyone has ever made against Tolkien, and it became a banner the genre's rebels would march under for decades. Fantasy, it was turning out, would do some of its very best work not by following its center, but by attacking it. And the hard, grim, disenchanted texture that Moorcock prized would 20 years on swell into a movement with a name of its own. Le Guin and Moorcock were only the sharpest edges of a whole restless decade. The 1970s were the genre's experimental adolescence, the years it tried on every shape at once. Roger Zelazny, who could write like a poet and plot like a pulp, launched his Chronicles of Amber in 1970, a series narrated by an amnesiac, world-weary immortal prince scheming his way through a family of demigods across worlds that are all imperfect shadows of one true city, fusing hard-boiled detective voice and high fantasy in a way no one had quite dared. Fantasy and science fiction, kept in separate boxes for decades, began bleeding into one another, until it was often impossible to say which one a given book belonged to. Anti-heroes multiplied. The old certainties about good and evil softened into something murkier and more adult. The reassuring Tolkien quest was still the commercial center of gravity, and would detonate at that center in 1977. But around its edges, the genre was quietly teaching itself to do other things, to turn inward and questioning like Le Guin, or rotten and doomed like Moorcock. None of these writers were trying to topple Tolkien outright. They were proving that the territory around him was far larger than anyone had assumed, and laying down the track that grimdark and the whole modern genre would later run on. But rebellion was only one of the forces tugging at fantasy, and in the short run, it was the weaker one. Because while Le Guin turned inward and Moorcock turned bitter, the marketplace was about to discover just how enormous this genre could be. And the hinge year was 1977. In April of that year, an unknown lawyer from small-town Illinois named Terry Brooks published The Sword of Shannara, a debut so openly and unashamedly modeled on The Lord of the Rings that the critics groaned. A dark lord, a reluctant ordinary hero, a perilous quest, a wise guide, the whole Tolkien architecture reskinned. And it did not matter in the slightest because it sold. By many accounts, it moved more than 100,000 copies in its first month, climbing onto the bestseller charts and becoming what is widely credited as the first work of fantasy fiction to reach the New York Times trade paperback bestseller list. Its editor, Lester Del Rey, had bet on a simple and slightly cynical idea, that there were huge numbers of readers who wanted nothing more than the feeling of Tolkien again. And he was spectacularly right. Whatever the critics thought of it, Brooks had proven the one thing the industry most needed to know. Tolkien had not been a freak event, a one-time miracle. The audience was real, and it was hungry, and it would buy much, much more. The same year drove the point home twice over. Stephen R. Donaldson, after dozens of rejections, published Lord Foul's Bane, the first of the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, and built his epic around perhaps the least likable protagonist the genre had ever centered, a bitter, isolated modern novelist stricken with leprosy, dropped into a beautiful fantasy world that seems to heal him, who refuses for book after book to believe any of it is real, and commits an unforgivable act early on that the whole series then has to reckon with. It was epic fantasy built around an anti-hero readers were not sure they could even stand, and it sold by the millions. In that same crowded year of 1977, Christopher Tolkien published The Silmarillion, the dense, austere, scripture-like mythology his father had labored over for a lifetime and never managed to finish. The deep history of the gods and the elder days that stands behind every page of The Lord of the Rings. It was a difficult, demanding book with no hobbits and little comfort, and it went straight to the top of the bestseller list anyway, carried there by nothing but the sheer hunger for more of Middle-earth. 3 landmark fantasies in a single 12-month stretch. After 1977, no publisher on Earth could pretend that fantasy was a niche. The 1980s took that raw commercial energy and began to widen what the genre was even allowed to be. In 1983, a former journalist named Terry Pratchett published The Color of Magic, the first of what would become the Discworld novels, and started doing something the genre's epic mainstream had almost entirely forgotten how to do: laughing. Discworld was set on a flat world, balanced on the backs of 4 elephants standing on a giant turtle swimming through space, and it took every cliché the genre had hardened into. The barbarian hero, the all-powerful wizard, the noble quest, the plucky farm boy, and turned them gently inside out with affectionate, razor-sharp satire. Over 3 decades and more than 40 books, it grew into one of the best-loved and best-selling bodies of work in all of British literature, proof that fantasy had matured enough to be in on its own joke. In 1984, a General Motors assembly line worker named Glenn Cook published a very different kind of book, The Black Company, which dragged the camera down out of the heavens and into the mud and the field hospitals. His story followed a band of hardened, weary mercenaries who happened to be working for the unambiguously evil side, narrated in the flat, gallows-humid voice of the company's physician and record keeper, a man called Croker, who writes down only what a soldier on the ground actually sees, and never the grand design. There were no shining heroes here and no clear moral high ground, only professionals doing grim and brutal jobs and trying to live through another campaign. And in that mud, almost unnoticed, the seeds of fantasy's next rebellion were already being sown. But that rebellion was still a decade away. Through the 1980s, what actually filled the shelves was something far more comfortable. The great commercial epic, sold in fat trilogies and sprawling multi-book sagas. David Eddings turned the Tolkien quest into a warm, reliable, briskly readable formula with the Belgariad beginning in 1982. Raymond Feist opened his own sprawling Riftwar saga with Magician that same year, and the Dragonlance novels, which Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman launched in 1984 out of a Dungeons & Dragons campaign, proved that a shared invented world could sell millions of copies on its own. It was fantasy as dependable comfort food, and it sold and sold and sold. But buried in that comfortable decade was one writer quietly pointing somewhere else. In 1988, Tad Williams began Memory, Sorrow and Thorn, a vast, slow, deliberately traditional-looking epic that subverted its own cliches from the inside. And a then-struggling television writer named George R.R. Martin would later credit it as part of what convinced him that epic fantasy could be written for grown-ups and taken seriously. The grandest of all those epics arrived in 1990. A former nuclear engineer and Vietnam veteran, writing as Robert Jordan, launched The Wheel of Time, an intricate, sprawling secondary world saga that would eventually run to 14 enormous volumes, sell tens of millions of copies, and define epic fantasy for a whole generation of fans. It grew so vast that when Jordan died in 2007 with the story still unfinished, it took another writer, a young Brandon Sanderson, handpicked to complete it from Jordan's notes, 3 more doorstop novels to bring the wheel full circle. Jordan was the true heir of Tolkien's scale and Brooks's commercial proof. Fantasy as a years-long act of immersion, a world readers did not merely visit but moved into and inhabited across decades of their own lives. The 1990s were the high watermark of that grand, sincere, world-spanning epic. And it was precisely against that towering earnestness that the genre's next rebellion would sharpen itself. That rebellion arrived in full force in the mid-1990s, and it eventually took its name from an unlikely place: a tabletop wargame. Warhammer 40,000 had sold itself with a tagline promising that in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and from those 2 words, grim and dark, readers would eventually coin a label for the kind of fantasy that had given up on idealism altogether. though the word itself only truly caught on years afterward in the online book forums of the 2000s and 2010s, applied backward to the wave that was rising. Grimdark. Its towering figure published his first volume in 1996. George R.R. Martin's A Game of Thrones, the opening book of A Song of Ice and Fire, did to epic fantasy what Cook had only hinted at, and Moorcock had demanded openly. It took the noble, orderly, reassuring Tolkien template and filled it with cold political scheming, moral murk, sexual violence, and a constant, genuine, stomach-dropping danger. The sense that any character at all, however heroic or beloved or central, might simply be executed when the politics required it, and frequently was. Readers who had been trained by 1,000 Tolkien imitators to trust that the hero always survives found that trust deliberately shattered again and again. Critics began calling Martin the anti-Tolkien, and when his saga became a global television phenomenon in the 2010s, watched by tens of millions, his grimmer and grittier vision of fantasy became, for the better part of a decade, the dominant one in the entire culture. It is worth being honest here though, the way the genre's own historians are, Martin did not invent dark fantasy. Moorcock and Cook had gotten there well before him, and the word grimdark itself comes from a war game, not from his books. He is the writer who carried the grim mode into the global mainstream. And even now, scholars argue about whether his own work truly counts as grimdark at all, or whether it is something more humane sitting just beside it. While the genre was turning dark for adults, something at the opposite end of the spectrum was quietly making it gigantic. In 1997, a then unknown and nearly penniless writer named Joanne Rowling, publishing as J.K. Rowling, released Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, the story of an orphaned boy who discovers on his 11th birthday that he is a wizard and is whisked off to a boarding school of magic. Over the next decade, the boy wizard did what nothing else in the genre's long history had ever managed. He made fantasy the default culture of an entire generation of children, who lined up at midnight for each new volume. And then those children grew up and kept reading fantasy, refusing to put it down. The series became one of the best-selling in all of publishing history, and it set off a gold rush in young adult fantasy that has never really slowed since. Fantasy was no longer a slightly embarrassing section in the back corner of the shop. It was the front table, the window display, the thing everyone was reading on the train. Rowling did not appear out of nowhere, and she did not stand alone. The same years carried a wave of fantasy aimed at the young that took the genre seriously as literature. Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials, beginning in 1995, was a fierce philosophical trilogy about a girl, her shape-shifting animal soul, and a war against a tyrannical heaven. Proof that children's fantasy could carry the full weight of real and dangerous ideas. After Potter came a flood of inheritors chasing the enormous young adult market Rowling had revealed, from Boy and His Dragon Adventures to the rise of dark academia. For the first time, a child could grow up entirely inside fantasy, from picture books to teenage epics, and never once be told they had outgrown it. The genre had captured the young, and the young do not let go of what they love. As that audience exploded outward, a new kind of craftsman rose up to serve it, the systematizers. In 2006, a young writer named Brandon Sanderson published Mistborn, set in a world where magic is drawn from swallowing and burning particular metals, each with a precise and predictable effect, and around books like it, he began articulating a whole philosophy of magic that would shape an entire generation of world builders coming up behind him. In a now famous essay in 2007, he set down what is called Sanderson's first law, roughly that an author's ability to satisfyingly solve a story's problems with magic is directly proportional to how well the reader actually understands how that magic works. It was the clearest modern statement anyone had made of hard magic. Magic with rules so consistent and knowable that the reader can follow the hero's clever solution, like the answer to a fair mystery. He did not invent the idea. Le Guin's true names had pointed straight down this road back in 1968, and decades of fantasy role-playing games had been drilling rule-bound magic into millions of players. What Sanderson did was name it and teach it patiently and publicly, lecture after lecture and lore after lore, until rule-bound magic became one of the defining tastes of all of modern fantasy. That same year, 2007, Patrick Rothfuss published The Name of the Wind, a lush, lyrical, more mysterious book about a gifted young musician and magician, proof that the systematizers had not won the entire field, and that there was still an enormous appetite for magic that kept some of its secrets. Sanderson, for his part, did not stop at a lore or two. He set out to build something the genre had never quite attempted, a single connected universe he calls the Cosmere, spanning dozens of planned novels across many different worlds, each with its own meticulously engineered magic, all of them secretly part of one vast hidden architecture. Tolkien's world-deep history rebuilt, with an engineer's blueprints and a release schedule. But the field never narrowed to a single taste. Running alongside the systematizers was a quieter, character-first tradition. Writers like Robin Hobb, whose long, intimate, emotionally devastating sagas proved that readers would follow one wounded character across thousands of pages, so long as the heart of it stayed true. Modern fantasy spilled out in every direction at once. Grimdark beside cozy, hard magic beside dreamlike, doorstop epic beside slim standalone, and it widened steadily in who was allowed to write it and whose myths it drew upon, as authors reached past the old Northern European defaults into African, Asian, Caribbean, and indigenous traditions for the raw material of brand new invented worlds. The genre had stopped being a single shelf with one book at its center. It had become a whole continent. The genre kept widening too, in who it let speak and what it chose to honor. In 2015, N.K. Jemisin published the 5th season, the first book of a trilogy set on a world racked by world-ending geological catastrophe, narrated in part in a daring and intimate second-person voice, and she went on to win the Hugo Award for Best Novel 3 years running, for all 3 books in the series, the first author ever to win the genre's top prize 3 years in a row. It was a genuine watershed. The genre's highest honor, claimed 3 times in a row for ambitious, formally adventurous, fiercely intelligent fantasy from a Black American author, in a field that had been overwhelmingly white for nearly the entire century this documentary has been tracing. The center of fantasy was not just being attacked anymore, it was being widened and shared. The widening went in more than one direction too. Fantasy reached past its old Northern European furnishings toward whole new wellsprings of myth. Nnedi Okorafor drew on Nigerian and broader African tradition for fantasy she pointedly calls African Jujuism, marking it off from the Western defaults. Tomi Adeyemi's Children of Blood and Bone in 2018 built a blockbuster epic on West African mythology and sold it to a young audience that had rarely seen its own legends on a fantasy cover before. Ken Liu spun an entire silkpunk aesthetic out of East Asian history and craft. Writers from across the world began building secondary worlds out of the stories their own grandparents had told them, and the genre that had spent a century recycling the same elves and the same Norse gods discovered that it had the whole of humanity's mythological inheritance to draw on. The map of fantasy after 4,000 years was at last growing as large as the world itself. Then comes the present, and it arrives on a phone. In 2015, the very same year as Jemisin's breakthrough, Sarah J. Maas published A Court of Thorns and Roses, and in 2023, Rebecca Yarros published Fourth Wing, a story of a deadly war college for dragon riders. And together they crowned a wave that readers and booksellers had started calling romantasy. Fantasy with romance at its core, discovered and devoured and championed by vast communities of readers talking to one another on TikTok. Cynics are quick to call it brand new, and they are wrong about that. The blend of romance and the fantastic is as old as the fairy tale, as old as Beauty and the Beast. What is genuinely new is the scale and the speed and the way the name was made. Romantasy is a genre subcategory driven not so much by critics or publishers as by ordinary readers recommending books to one another on their phones. The very same ancient impulse that first carved Gilgamesh into clay, now moving at the speed of a scrolling video feed. It is worth pausing on just how far that has carried the genre. In the early 2020s, fantasy, and romantasy especially, became one of the fastest growing categories in all of publishing, driven not by reviews or prizes or bookshop displays, but by readers filming themselves weeping over books on their phones and passing the recommendation along to millions of strangers. Authors who had been quietly self-publishing found themselves with sudden runaway hits. Backlist novels years old sold out everywhere because a single short video had caught fire. The old gatekeepers, the critics, the prize juries, the literary establishment that had spent a full century looking down on fantasy as childish, discovered that they no longer held the keys at all. The readers did. The very audience the genre had been built for ever since MacDonald first dared to write fairy tales for grown men and women had finally seized full control of which fantasies rose and which were forgotten, and they were using that power to crown stories of magic and longing and impossible love by the million. The genre that spent most of its history without so much as a shelf of its own now sets the pace for the whole industry. No longer the disreputable thing at the bottom of the cultural ladder, but by some measures the very center of popular fiction itself. The phone did more than recommend books, it let readers make them. In those same years, the old gates of publishing simply swung open. Self-publishing, once a polite synonym for failure, became a genuine career. A writer could now put a fantasy novel straight onto readers' devices with no house's permission at all, and a whole shadow industry of independent fantasy authors grew up alongside the traditional one, some of them outselling all but its biggest names. With the gatekeepers bypassed, the genre splintered into 1,000 niches, each with its own devoted readership. And one of the strangest and most telling was cozy fantasy. These were gentle, low-stakes stories in which the great quest is swapped out for opening a coffee shop or running a struggling bookstore, where almost nothing dangerous is allowed to happen, and that restfulness is precisely the point. A retired orc settling down to bake, a weary adventurer who wants nothing more than some peace. After a century of dark lords and apocalypses, a large slice of the audience turned out to want fantasy that simply felt like a warm place to sit. The genre had grown big enough and secure enough in itself to hold both the end of the world and a quiet afternoon, and to let readers, not publishers, choose which one they were in the mood for. And it did not stop at the page. The same decades carried fantasy onto the largest screens in the world. Tolkien's trilogy became, in the early 2000s, one of the most acclaimed and lucrative film series ever made. Martin's saga became the defining television event of the 2010s. And in the years since, the streaming giants have spent fortunes racing to adapt the genre's biggest worlds, from Middle-earth to the Wheel of Time to the Witcher's continent. The boy who once read a paperback under his school desk, hiding it from a teacher who thought he had outgrown such things, had lived to see what he was reading become, within a single human lifetime, the most expensive and most fought-over kind of story in all of entertainment. The genre that for a century could barely get any respect now commanded the biggest budgets on Earth. And fantasy did not stop at screens either. It had already conquered the most interactive medium of all. In 1974, two hobbyists named Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson published Dungeons & Dragons, a game with no board and no winner, in which the players simply imagine their way through an invented world narrated aloud by a friend. And in doing so, they turned a whole generation of readers into world builders, and built the pipeline that would feed half the fantasy writers of the next 50 years. From the tabletop, the genre poured into the video game, until the elves and dungeons and monsters that Gygax had assembled in turned out of Tolkien, and the pulps became the native vocabulary of an entire entertainment industry that now takes in more each year than the world's box offices and recorded music combined. Some of the most acclaimed games ever made are epic fantasies, and the circle closed completely in 2022, when one of them, Elden Ring, drew the deep mythology of its invented world from none other than George R.R. Martin, the novelist who had once been fantasy's great disruptor, now handing the ancient history of a game world to millions of players. The story that began as marks pressed into wet clay had become something people did not merely read but lived inside for hundreds of hours at a stretch by the millions. Fantasy was no longer just a kind of book. It had become one of the largest engines of the human imagination on the planet. Step back then and look at the whole shape of it across 4,000 years. The impossible is the oldest thing literature ever did, older than the writing that first recorded it. It took very nearly all of human history for that impossible to harden into a genre with a name, and that name was barely pinned down before the genre began, restlessly and almost immediately, to take itself apart and build itself new again, turning inward with Le Guin, bitter with Moorcock, commercial in 1977, satirical with Pratchett, grim with Martin, mass market with Rowling, systematic with Sanderson, and at last toward romance on millions of phone screens. The one true constant across all of it, from the clay tablet to the touchscreen, is the act itself. A person invents a world that cannot possibly exist and offers it to another person who agrees for a little while to believe in it. And the next link in that chain has not been written yet, and there is no reason on earth it couldn't be written by you. If you have ever wanted to take your own impossible world and turn it into a finished novel, that is exactly what my course, The Complete System for Writing Your Fantasy Novel, was built to help you do, walking you the whole way from the blank first page to the final draft. It's open to join now, because in 4,000 years, the one thing this genre has never once done is run out of people willing to dream up the impossible and dare the rest of us to believe it.